Just waiting for it to go live on YouTube and then I'll get started. I think a few people are watching. Oh, great. Okay, I think we're live on YouTube. So, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on risk assessments. My name is Stephanie Lucas and I am the Network Coordinator at UK Women in Fisheries. Today, we're looking at risk assessments, not just as a paperwork exercise, but as a real tool to improve safety at sea and in our working spaces, wherever that may be. We know this is an important topic, and we're really lucky to have two fantastic speakers here to share their insights. First, we have Charles Blythe from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations, also known as the NFFO. And Charles is passionate about safety in the industry and works directly with fishermen to make risk assessments practical and effective. We're also joined by Lynn Reid of Macduff Shellfish. Lynn has hands-on experience in bridging the gap between risk assessments on paper and real safety practices at sea. So we're currently streaming on YouTube, and we've already received some great questions ahead of time, and we'll try to tackle those throughout the session and at a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you do think of a question during the live webinar, please drop it in the YouTube chat and we'll do our best to answer it. We know that risk assessments affect everybody in this industry, which is why this webinar is for a broad audience, not just those working at sea, and not just members of UK Women in Fisheries either. Whether you're in a boat or on a desk or anywhere in between, this conversation matters, and I hope you enjoy it. I will soon let Lynn and Charles get started, but first wanted to let you know a little bit more about UK Women in Fisheries. We are now nearing the end of a 6-month funded period made possible by the Seafarers Charity, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and from some fast funding as well. Their support allows us to bring discussions like these to the industry in webinars for everybody to enjoy and learn. So thank you very much to them. So with that, let's get started. Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and greetings, everybody. My name is Charles. I'm a Risk Safety and Training Lead for the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations, or NFFO for short. I also run my own maritime consultancy, primarily providing service to the fishing industry with a core focus on safety management, implementation, risk mitigation, and survey preparation. I have a background in naval architecture and used to be a surveyor for the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency before I changed sides, so to speak, and started directly supporting the fishing industry. I'd like to firstly thank Women in Fisheries Network for inviting me here today. Later on in the presentation, as Stephanie mentioned, I will also be joined by Lynn Reid, who is the Fleet Operations Manager at Macduff Shellfish, and she will be providing her perspective of risk assessment within the fishing industry. So in today's webinar, I will be covering the following, including the basic principles of risk management, the typical form and content of risk assessments, some examples of when it all goes wrong and where risk assessments have not worked, as well as the best practice and next steps for following the completion of a risk assessment. Since I first became involved in the fishing industry, I have seen a significant shift in owners and crew taking the process of risk management much more seriously. And that is absolutely excellent to see. However, it is clear that much more work needs to be done to ensure crew, owners and management understand risk and the importance of reducing this to reasonable levels in the workplace. Although this presentation will focus around risk assessments primarily on board fishing vessels, the principles remain the same for any workplace or activity, and I hope what we go through today is of value to all attendees of this webinar. So why? Risk assessment occurs in every part of your life, often without you even realizing it. It is something we do naturally, whether that is walking down the street or boiling a kettle. However, in everyday life, we tend not to document such risk assessments, and instead the process is what is considered to be dynamic. However, in the workplace and public spaces, things are very different. In UK law, whether it is on land or at sea, a workplace must have a risk assessment and the risks be assessed. And this includes anything you interact with or any machinery you may operate or any hazards which just generally exist in your day-to-day work. In UK law, this is underpinned by health and safety executive regulations, and in the maritime sector by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. There are two main mechanisms and key pieces of legislation which require risk assessments in the workplace. The first is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and the Merchant Shipping and Fishing Vessels Health and Safety at Work regulations. There are also many other pieces of legislation and guidance which further underpins risk assessments and their requirements. Although technically already required, in fishing, following recommendations from the Marine Accident Investigation Branch, or MAIB for short, there have been further developments in the requirements for risk assessments. The MCA have mandated specific risk assessments are provided for specific tasks. These include man overboard recovery and enclosed space entry, to name a few. Although they should probably have been risk assessed already due to previous accidents and incidents, there has been further focus on these specific areas. The basic principles of risk assessment are as follows. Hazard identification. Identify the hazard. This could be a specific activity, the use of a certain piece of equipment, or the hazard of a piece of equipment in use failing. Assess for risk. How likely is the risk to occur? And what is the consequence if a risk was to impact someone at work? The third step is to apply control measures. What can be put in place to mitigate that risk, such as personal protective equipment, define processes to follow, and to reduce the likelihood of that risk occurring. The list of control measures is potentially endless. And finally, record your findings. This is an area where fishing vessels have historically struggled with, although I can see that this is beginning to change. I have visited many a clearly safely run fishing vessel with specific measures in place to keep the crew and vessel safe. However, they were never documented. And as an owner or a skipper of a fishing vessel, this in reality could expose you if they are not documented and something was to go wrong. As owners are now beginning to understand the value of documenting such risk assessments, this is starting to change. In the next few slides, I will be diving slightly deeper into each aspect of the basic principles. Hazard identification. Whether on a large scallop dredger or a single-handed potting vessel, the process for identifying hazards is exactly the same. Personally, I find the best way to begin this process when starting it from scratch is by first grabbing a pen and a notebook and standing on the quay away from your vessel, or in fact your workplace. The principle remains the same. Before doing anything, start noting down the activities that you are doing or are about to do, whether that is using a pontoon ladder to access your vessel or for climbing over multiple vessels to gain access. The list should also note down the key equipment which is to be used in order to undertake the necessary activities. The ID or identification process should continue as you are leading up to fishing, hauling, and even landing your catch. The whole process should be risk assessed. And it is important to note, especially on a fishing vessel, risk factors may change throughout any voyage cycle. and particular areas such as stability, crew fatigue, or even fuel level should be considered as part of this. As a wider concept, the identification list should recognize anything that could cause harm, such as unsafe working practices, machinery, hazardous substances, environmental factors, or any occurrence which could put workers or the vessel in danger. As you can see on my screen here, you have a few useful examples of where risk may have not have been controlled or mitigated for. Or in actual fact, as we all know in fishing, things may go wrong at sea and temporary mitigation may need to be put in place. A prime example of that is the picture on the top right of the screen where a guardrail has broken, but it has been temporarily secured to provide that protection to the crew for the remainder of the voyage. In that particular example, that guardrail was properly repaired as soon as the vessel was in harbour and a permanent repair was complete. Once you have identified hazards, you then need to decide how likely it is that someone could be harmed and how serious it could be. This is called assessing the level of risk. You need to decide who might be harmed and how, what you're already doing to control these risks, what further action you should take to control these risks further, who needs to carry out this action, and when the action is needed by. There are a number of ways of converting what is quite a dry metric into something which is then comparable. The most common method is a form of risk assessment matrix, as you can see on the screen. Although this can also be demonstrated in numbers, to ensure the main risks catch the eye to the end user, it is always useful to convert numbers into a traffic light system such as the one showed here. And again, this is all about helping or enabling the end user, i.e. the skipper, the crew, to understand what control measures you as an owner or a company would like to have in place or must have in place. Controlling the risk. This is naturally the most important aspect of the risk assessment process. Defining the appropriate control measure to make the hazard as safe as possible. There is a useful hierarchy of controls which is in existence, which I often use in the process of risk assessment. The first is elimination. Can the actual hazard be removed entirely? If that is not possible, you then follow the next step. Substitution. Is it possible to replace the hazard with a less hazardous alternative, whether that is an alternative piece of equipment or an alternative working practice? Engineering controls. Isolate people from hazards, such as using barriers, guards, or ventilation. A prime example of this is the moving belts on engines in machinery spaces. Any contact with these whilst they are in operation could be absolutely catastrophic. However, by using a simple guard or barrier, that risk is all of a sudden eliminated. Administrative controls. Implement procedures, training, and safe working practices. This is something that I see the fishing vessel is still on a journey with. However, the vessel owners and skippers and crew that I've worked with have quickly seen the value of documenting procedures, which will enhance understanding and may also protect them in the event of something going wrong. The final one, although it is often the first thing that a risk assessor may turn to, is personal protective equipment. I try to use this as a last resort when other measures are insufficient. Next steps following a risk assessment. In the progressive world of safety management in the maritime sector that we currently live in, this process often doesn't just stop at a risk assessment. In many sectors, which are now starting to include fishing, it has become very useful and often a requirement to demonstrate how the risk assessments are enacted. A prime example of this in recent years within the fishing industry is lifting equipment and the lifting equipment plans, which underpin how that equipment is maintained, inspected, and verified as safe. This process can come in many forms, such as documented standard operating procedures or method statements. This may also include the use of forms or checklists to ensure the necessary factors have been considered as a task is being carried out. Taking this further, this could all at this point then develop into what we would refer to as a permit to work system, which is what it says on the tin. An example of this, how a permit to work could work, is an engineer needs to work on a piece of moving machinery in the engine room of a fishing vessel. By using a permit to work system, the process can be controlled and the necessary equipment can be isolated, preventing any accidental startup of an engine, which could lead to a serious accident or indeed a fatality. A very important aspect is to monitor the effect of a risk assessment. Has it gone too far? Are the people who are meant to comply with starting to not understand or get the control measures which you are wanting to put in place? In wider terms, is it fit for purpose? Getting buy-in and understanding from crew in risk assessment is absolutely crucial. Gone are the days where placing a file of risk assessments in a wheelhouse and assuming your crew will know where it is and where to find it is long gone. You need to work with crew, skippers, and any other person who is part of that process to ensure it is meaningful. In the example on your screen, you can see how a fishing vessel has used a mechanical control measure to reduce of the risk of a shackle securing a block failing in this instance. In order for the risk assessment to be meaningful, the end user needs a clear understanding and awareness of the risk assessments in place. Often the best way and the simplest way to do this is through a mechanism such as a toolbox talk, which in summary is simply the process of speaking with your team and getting engagement on the activity which has been risk assessed. They may even, as part of this process, provide useful suggestions which you may previously not have thought of, which would further mitigate risk and keep everybody safe. Another aspect which is very important and is underpinned in UK law is the requirement to monitor and review risk assessments. In general terms, this should be done on an at least annual basis or when an activity or a piece of equipment changes. Maintenance. As I just mentioned, risk assessments should be reviewed on an annual basis. Often, fishing companies have historically missed this requirement. A simple solution: set a reminder in your calendar on an annual basis to prompt you to review your risk assessments, or even use a system which reminds you of when this is due. There are various safety management systems available to the fishing industry now, some for free and some you pay for, which essentially will do this job for you and remind you when risk assessments need reviewing. Land and maritime health and safety law is very clear and places a direct obligation on business owners to ensure a workplace is safe. Although it is important to always strive to improve what you do and further reduce risk to your workers or crew, it is important to ensure buy-in exists from them, and to listen to feedback that they may provide. As a general principle, risk should be controlled in a term which is often referred to as low as reasonably practical. This, to me, is a slightly open-ended principle, but it is there to ensure that businesses and owners take all reasonable steps to ensure control measures are in place and that they are effective. Many of you may have also heard of the KISS principle. Keep it simply safe, or as I often say, keep it simple, stupid. This is something I am very passionate about. If the measures you put in place are not simple, practical, or easy to follow, they are unlikely to be complied with, which makes, in summary, the assessment almost worthless. It needs to be reasonable. Although attention to detail is crucial, that doesn't necessarily equal complicated. In my eyes, the simpler, the better. In recent years, the fishing industry has been subject to a wave of new safety regulations, some which were absolutely needed, and others which arguably have been detrimental to safety on fishing vessels, depending on who you speak to. A key example of this is the MCA's push to require the use of inflatable life jackets on fishermen, regardless of the circumstance. Although many support this, we must be realistic. In fishing, there are certain activities which a inflatable life jacket may not be the most suitable piece of equipment to use, and may even damage the PFD, so it cannot be relied upon. And this is a prime example of where attention to detail is crucial, and that a blanket requirement to use a piece of equipment may not always be the best way forward. Risk assessments take many different forms and styles. In the example shown here, it has been simply broken down into useful parts, which can be understandable and understood by the user creating the risk assessments, as well as the user at the end who is expected to eventually comply with this. The hazard has been identified and the risk associated with the hazard has been defined. The risk itself has been calculated considering likelihood and consequence, as you can see in the pre-control risk. The risk controls, and what I see as the especially important part, has then been defined, and the post-control risks are there for all to understand. This enables a like-for-like comparison of how the risk has been reduced using the control measures. As you can see in this example, the risk which was once considered high is now considered moderate. And as you can see, this was in relation to working on an open deck of a scallop fishing vessel. Additionally, in this example, the interval, the person responsible to enact this risk assessment, and the last review date are also being recorded. Form and content. This is the next step from a risk assessment if you really want to enhance the processes and the control measures that you have put in place. In a typical operating procedure or method statement, the following should be covered. Identify the process and the staff or crew are expected to follow. It should then define the scope, process, responsibility, and training requirements related to that task. It should also identify the equipment which is expected to be used as part of successful completion of that procedure. It's always really useful to help the end user to summarize or link relevant risk assessments that the procedure is based upon. This is you essentially enacting the risk assessments, either one by one or collectively. Again, the procedure should be regularly reviewed and adjusted as and when risk assessments or equipment changes. I will now hand over to Lynn Reed, Fleet Operations Manager at Macduff Shellfish, who will be providing her experiences and insights of risk assessments within the Macduff scallop fleet and the wider fishing industry.
Hi, I'm Lynn Reed. I just want to thank Charles for all the information we've received tonight. It's very useful for all of us, even myself included. I just want to say, first of all, that within our fleet, we've found over the recent years, things have improved vastly. And having a comprehensive risk assessment for all the hazards and that on board definitely help everyone at the time, just trying to improve the safety culture and keep everyone safe on board. As a whole, we found that we started off with just sort of templates, going through things with the crew individually, having toolbox talks as such with all the crew, just to work out what the risks were, what sort of procedures you needed to put in place to adapt the risk assessments for the vessels. And over time, it's just built up. And we find now that the crew are quite happy to come to you if they see something that needs to be adapted onto the risk assessments, and they're quite happy to discuss with ourselves or their skipper, and we can get that implemented. With the templates that we've got, they're very easy for the crew to use and to come back to myself with feedback. We do have annual reviews, but should something happen on board, if there's an incident or an accident, we would also then make sure that we're reviewing the risk assessments along with that at the same time. The sort of way that we want to enact the mitigation, for the crew, the company want in place, is that we have these conversations, we communicate clearly with everyone, and we try to ensure there's a positive safety culture, which begins with management and falls down. We expect people to follow the rules and recognise, the sort of positive attitude and reward them when incidents and that are reported. We don't want to be seen to put people off reporting things, because this is how you end up with relevant risk assessments. And we just monitor and review. Sorry, I'm not really sure what else. Charles, is there any sort of experiences you're looking for from me, in relation to the risk assessments?
No, that's really useful, Lynn. And I must say, obviously, I visit a lot of different fishing vessel companies in my work, and Macduff Shellfish were one of the companies where, when I went on board your vessels, I immediately saw that the crew understood risk assessments and that there was engagement between the ownership and management and the actual crew on board. And I just would love to maybe hear a bit more about how you managed to kind of break that barrier and actually get the buy-in from the crew and allow them to respect the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, originally, like you'll know yourself, that through the years, there maybe wasn't as much respect placed on the importance of risk assessments on board. However, once you've built relationships with your crew and they understand that what's important to you as an owner, operator, is that these people are safe on board the vessels, and that ultimately that's what we want. We want everyone to go home and to be able to do their job in the safest manner. We know how dangerous the fishing industry is, but we want to make it as safe as reasonably practicable for these people to do their jobs and go home at the end of the trip, or whenever they're on board. And by actually communicating with them and finding out what is involved in the tasks that they do on board, and taking feedback from them when you're trying to incorporate something into a risk assessment. Like, say, for example, you're talking about the personal flotation devices earlier and the importance of wearing those on board. And you're absolutely right. There's not always a place for them as such, or if they are, they've got to make sure that they're wearing them correctly, because we said make sure you're wearing PFDs, but what some of them were doing was maybe removing crotch straps because the threat of entanglement. So, you know, you had to adapt the risk assessment so that they were wearing them at the most appropriate times and wearing the PPE effectively as well. So it was all things like this that the risk assessment won't just be once. You know, you need to review it, well, I find quite regular, and every year, every time there's an incident or accident, there's always something that you can add to, you know, to hopefully reduce any further risks to anyone on board. So I find that it's a constant thing. But once you've got the template in place and you know what you're expecting and they expect as well, then it's easy enough to keep on top of. But communication, that's got to be the first part of this, is speaking with the crew and finding out what the job entails. And after that, you know, it's not difficult to go to them and say, look, you know, what you're doing here, can you advise how you do it? And then they know that I'm there to help support them, because not everyone likes that admin function of the paperwork side of things. So if you can provide them with, you know, a traffic light system with the risk assessments, it's so much easier for them to understand, especially for the other crew. You might have crew on there that maybe English isn't their first language. And so the colour chart works very well for all of them. So.
Yeah. No, thank you, Lynn. That's really, really useful. And as you've mentioned, communication is absolutely essential. I'd even go as far as saying, as we all know, we have a international workforce within the UK fishing industry now, with varying languages and levels of English language on board vessels. And one key take I have from that is to, if you want your crew to understand risk assessment, provide it in their first language. They will understand it then, instead of trying to translate from English into their own language themselves. So something which can easily be done and might make quite a difference. But no, thank you, Lynn. Really appreciate your thoughts there.
Sorry, I was a little bit nervous there, so I was just I wasn't sure if I've actually covered everything. I think I took plenty more notes and just kind of lost track there. Sorry.
Brilliant. No, that's absolutely fine. And safety management is a journey. Rome wasn't built in a day, so to speak. And one of the key principles of safety management is continuous improvement. Every year you will see something different, or notice another hazard which needs accounting for, etc. So that is absolutely okay and is a good thing almost. So
a comprehensive safety management system is worth its weight in gold should anything happen on board any of your vessels. You know, it will show people that you do care and you do have a safety culture on board, and you need to be able to document everything these days between, you know, your checklist. You never know when that information will become important.
Yeah, for sure. And unfortunately, there has been a number of vessels in the fishing industry in recent years who have experienced the pain of not having the correct risk assessments and procedures in place, and the fallout that often creates, whether that's legally, etc. So important. But no, thank you, Lynn. And that does bring me on to my next topic, which is when risk assessments have failed. As you can see here on my screen, there's some interesting photos for you to absorb whilst I just discuss them. And however, often the failure of risk assessments is best presented in the form of discussing injuries. However, I don't particularly want to show you graphic photos of injuries. So instead, I've opted to provide some material defects which could have caused a significant injury or fatality should they not have been accounted for. In the line of work I am involved in, I work in the area of trying to identify and control risks before an injury can even occur. Much of the issues on fishing vessels I see, which translate into significant risks for fishers, are often down to the selected equipment in use, lack of maintenance, or procedures in use not being defined or considered. And a few examples of that are here. The left photo shows a shackle which I removed off a fishing vessel last month. This shackle was used to secure a rope block which was situated above crews' heads. And from my calculations, I think it was subject to a load of around a ton or so. So if that was to fail, the consequences may have been significant. When investigated, the vessel had no risk assessment in place for lifting equipment failure, which is what this equipment relates to. Nor did they have any regime in place to regularly inspect this equipment. Following starting that risk assessment process for work on deck from scratch, which was very much needed in this circumstance, the failure was quickly mitigated for. A wear limit was put in place and a monthly regime for documenting the inspections of the lifting equipment was defined. And obviously the shackle was immediately replaced. In the second photo, a pilot ladder had not been checked before use by a large fishing vessel. Boarding a vessel via pilot ladder can be a very high-risk activity with defined mitigation which has to be put in place, underpinned by international conventions and national regulations due to the significant risk and fatalities experienced by people using pilot ladders in the past. Evidently, the ladder in the photo had not been checked, resulting in the pilot refusing to board the vessel with significant financial consequences to the owner, missing tides, missing crew changes, all sorts. However, at least a serious injury or fatality had been avoided. By the use of a simple risk assessment to cover the pre-use inspection of that piece of equipment, that whole scenario could have been avoided. For the sake of good order, it is also worth pointing out the loops in these man ropes which should not be there according to the international guidance on pilot ladders. And finally, in the right photo, this one's probably a bit more hidden for your eyes to see. Obviously, it is a life raft which was recently serviced and hastily installed by a vessel's crew so they could head to sea and begin fishing. There was no process in place or put in place by the skipper or management for ensuring safety equipment was properly installed following removal from a vessel. As a result, if this had not been picked up, what I mean by that is the black strap had a label on it clearly defining that that strap must be cut off before use, otherwise the life raft wouldn't inflate. And it is fastened by other means. If this had not have been picked up and the vessel's crew had to abandon ship, the life raft would have not inflated as intended, potentially leading to multiple fatalities. So yeah, hopefully you find a couple of material examples of equipment failures relevant to risk assessments useful. Finally, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me and participating in this webinar. I hope you have found it useful. If you have any further questions following this webinar or would like to reach out to me, my email addresses are mentioned here. I'd now like to open up the floor to answer any questions that participants may have.
Charles, thank you. This webinar has been absolutely amazing. I've learned a lot myself. We have had a few questions come in, so I'll just read them out and hopefully you're able to help or maybe direct us to some other people who might be able to. So the first question is about having a high turnover of crew working on different boats or with different crew. What is the best practice to ensure compliance, for example, if they're taking someone as a stand-in?
So yeah, really, really good question. And it is something I see on a daily basis, crew moving from one company to the other and expected technically to comply with different risk assessments depending on what day of the week it is. The way I have helped a number of owners control that to an extent is insisting that any time a new person works on board a vessel, whether that is temporary or permanently, is that they receive a full and proper induction of the vessel. And as part of that induction, they are directed to the vessel's risk assessment and given time to kind of understand the main principles of them and then document that they have done so. Although this, I must stress, isn't ideal, but obviously give them time to read and understand them. What this will do is, to an extent, protect the owner and the skipper should that crew member you probably don't know decide to act dangerously on board the vessel whilst at sea.
Thank you. That's so useful. Another question we've had is about in-person events. So, how do we assess the risks of in-person events that aren't happening yet?
So, really good question. Firstly, from the top of my head, the Health and Safety Executive have published guidance on their website regarding planning for events and how they should be risk assessed. As a starting point, if I was planning an event, I would obviously want to know the location of where it is and any existing hazards that are attributed to that location. So, for example, if you're using a church hall, it's very likely they may already have a set of risk assessments completed for the use of that space. To further help the risk assessment process when you're planning an event, it might also be worth considering, depending on the size of the event, do you need a first aid responder for illnesses, for example, or do steps going up to the toilets need lighting up or tape putting on them to show that they are a potential trip hazard? I wouldn't get overwhelmed with trying to risk assess for an event, but I would certainly follow the HSE guidance, which is actually really useful, which will guide you through that process and will also tell you what trigger points you may need to speak to your local council, or whoever who may also have an interest in the safe running of such an event.
A fascinating answer. Thank you. We did get lots of other questions, but you actually managed to answer them throughout the body of your webinar. A lot about how to get buy-in from crew members or to work with people who perhaps didn't really want to be dealing with risk assessments. So I think that might be it. So I'm just checking to see if we've had any new questions come in as I was literally just saying that. Looks like it's all good.
But yes, Stephanie, as Lynn mentioned, and also myself, one of the most important factors for getting buy-in from crew is to listen to them and respect their opinions. As you never know, it may be the most valuable opinion you hear that year. So never say never.
Never say never. No. Oh, thank you so much. And this has been definitely our most educational webinar so far. And I hope it has a real positive impact on everybody's safety. Thank you to everybody who has been listening and learning. And if you do have any questions, I know that Charles is always happy to answer them. Thank you for providing your contact details. This webinar will be available to watch on repeat if you need to on YouTube. So feel free to direct any friends or crew members that need to have a listen as well. But mostly, I just want to wish you, Charles and Lynn, a lovely evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for teaching us as well.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.
So the live stream will be stopping soon.